So you've got the tripod, you've set your shutter fast, and you've got that expensive lens that everyone swears by. You do everything right, and yet when you zoom into the photo that you've just taken, it still looks soft. Not blurry, just not very sharp. Now, you're not an idiot, so you double check your shutter speed, you check your ISO, and even the wind direction, but nothing explains it. And if that sounds familiar, then this video is for you, because the truth is that sharpness might not be quite what you think it is. Now, my name is Will, and I'm a fellow amateur photographer, and I've struggled with this exact issue, so I went down the rabbit hole to discover the truth. And in this video, I'm going to show you the small shift that's going to change how you think about taking sharp photos. If you miss it, you're going to keep wondering why your images never look crisp, no matter what camera settings or camera gear that you use. I remember the day that I bought my 60 megapixel Sony camera. I thought, that's it, no more blurry photos. For me, I paired it with a handful of sharp lenses, and I believe that, and I truly believe this, right, that if this doesn't get tack sharp images, nothing will. And for a while, I thought like it kind of worked. Most of the shots that I took looked great on the back of the camera, but then came the random photos that always looked a bit off. Not blurry, just kind of soft, and they lacked the bite that you often see in professional work. I'd take a photo of a landscape, I'd zoom in, and I'd wonder why the edges of the scene, the image, the foreground interest all looked a little bit mushy, even though I'd done everything right. The shutter speed was fast, the camera was on a tripod, the tripod was steady, focus was spot on, and it started to bother me because, well, the hobby of photography can obviously get kind of expensive. You might have experienced this as well, and when you're spending money on top-end gear, well, I expect top-end results. And I thought maybe it was an issue of a decentered lens or atmospheric haze, maybe even my eyesight. Obviously, I wear glasses, right? But deep down, I knew that something else was wrong. And if you've ever looked at your own images and felt that same quiet disappointment where a photo looks okay, but it lacks that wow quality, then you know exactly what I mean. It's a sinking feeling that makes you recheck every camera setting, even though you know after you take the photo that they were probably set up correctly. And I wanted answers on the back of all this, so I started testing everything. Same scene, same setup, different days. Sometimes the photos look crisp, other times it just fell flat. And that's when I learned about something that completely changed how I shoot. And it's this idea that sharpness isn't just what you capture when you press the shutter. The level of sharpness that you see in an image actually depends on how you perceive that image as well. And what that means in simple terms is that your camera can record a technically perfect image, but it's your eyes that decide, or your eyes and then the brain that's attached to your eyes, that decides how sharp those images feel or how soft they feel. And your eyes, well, they're a bit tricky. They judge sharpness based on contrast along edges. When bright and dark areas meet, suddenly our brain goes, oh, there's detail there. When they fade gradually from light to dark, our brain says, there is little detail there, that is soft. Now, think of a mountain skyline at sunset, right? Like the image that I'm showing you right now. The light is low, the edges glow softly, and everything looks calm and beautiful, but it's also a little bit soft, even though this particular image was captured technically, as perfectly technically as what I could manage, right? If you then compare a similar scene at midday when the sunlight is harsh and there's lots of crisp, sharp shadows, everything looks razor sharp. The camera settings on these two images, even though they're completely different locations, were basically the same, but our eyes interpret the scene differently because the contrast is harder. That is perceived sharpness, and none of this is particularly consistent either. Your perception of sharpness changes throughout the day. Studies have shown that in the morning when your eyes are fresh, everything looks sharper. Then after hours of scrolling and looking at screens, our eyes start to get tired, and suddenly the same image that looked sharp this morning is going to look less sharp, or it's going to be perceived to be less sharp later on in the day. Even our brain plays tricks on us with all of this. Bias comes into play with sharpness in a major way. If you show someone two identical prints, one labeled medium format or high quality and the other one labeled crop sensor or low quality, and I can hear people in the comments as I say this out loud going crazy that I've just assigned labels to medium format and crop sensor. That's not what I mean. You obviously get that this is a bias as opposed to reality when we look at the pixels and the sharpness in the image itself. But regardless, most people will swear that the medium format image looks sharper. And this realization about sharpness hit me particularly hard, right? Because when I first started doing landscape photography 2 years ago, I'd spent an ungodly amount of time watching gear review videos and obsessing over the supposed sharpness of all the lenses and even the filters that I was using, camera bodies, all that stuff. And the reality was that I was trying to solve what I thought was 100% an optical and engineering problem, when the reality is that perception plays a large piece in this puzzle as well. So I shifted focus. Instead of asking, how do I make my images sharper, I started asking, what makes a photo look sharp? And that's when I stumbled upon a word that sounds impressive and scientific, but it unlocked everything that I've been missing in my quest to take sharper photos. The word was acutance, and it's not as intimidating as it sounds. Acutance simply means how quickly light changes from dark to bright or bright to dark at the edges of the things within your photo. The faster that change, the sharper that the image appears. And let's break this down slightly, right? So imagine you're looking at two black and white lines. In one, the edge between the black and white lines is clean and it's sharp and it's sudden. In an ideal world, this is not possible for me doing landscape photography, for example, but maybe someone doing, I don't know, some kind of architectural photography. In certain circumstances, the perfect black and white line would be pixels bunched up against each other that are perfectly matched and there's no grey tone in between. So you imagine that on one side, and you imagine on the other that the black and the white pixels here of this line, there's a transition, there's a soft transition between the two. Both are in perfect focus, but one is going to look sharper than the other, and that's because it has higher acutance, or a stronger edge contrast. So what I discovered was that acutance is often the secret sauce that separates good photos from wow photos. You can have an image that's in perfect focus, there's zero motion blur in it, and you're using a top tier lens, but if your scene has low acutance and you're trying to make it sharp, let's say that there's fog in the scene or there's haze or it's particularly soft lighting, it's gonna look a little mushy. Now, if you're aiming for a softer photo and you're trying to capture an image like this, then perfect, job done. Don't worry about being it sharp. In fact, you don't want it sharp. This image, I actually added negative dehaze to further soften it. But if you're trying to capture a scene and you want it to look absolutely razor sharp, then this lack of acutance is going to stop you in your tracks. And this is not something that your camera can necessarily fix. Lenses can't add edge contrast where the light doesn't exist. So even if you're using a $5,000 lens and camera setup, a low acutance scene is still going to look soft. And when I learned this, it changed how I planned my shoots. If I wanted a razor sharp image, instead of only thinking about composition, I started to hunt down light that creates separation and lots of points of shadow and highlight in the scene. This is side-lit images, backlit images, anything where the edges of the things in the image start to pop because there is contrast between the light bit, the dark bit, and there's as close as you can get it, a razor sharp line between the two of them. I stopped blaming my camera gear, basically, is what happened, and I started trying to actually capture the right scenes instead. Now, the more of these high acutance scenes I shot, I found that the next issue that I came up against for sharp photos reared its head more and more. Now, these images tended to look great when I looked at them on the back of the camera, so I'd go through the shoot, I'd get the shot, I'd look at it on the camera, I'd be pumped, I'd be excited, but then when I opened these images in Lightroom, they once again looked kind of soft. And that led me to the next part of the puzzle, which is how to bring sharpness back after you press the shutter button. So after all this testing, I finally accepted it, right? My gear, and it should be, it's expensive Sony camera lenses and a Tamron lens that I use. It's all expensive gear. It's all, well, it's relative. I was going to say well looked after. It's not particularly well looked after, but it's expensive and it should be top notch. And so I realized that the gear wasn't the issue, right? The real issue that I was having was going from JPEG image on back of the camera to the RAW file on the computer. So I needed to sort that out next. So I opened Lightroom and I started digging into something that previously I'd basically ignored, and that was post-capture sharpening. And here's what I found. On every digital photo, no matter how good your camera is, the lenses, the tripod setup, all that good stuff, it's always going to come out slightly soft when you bring the RAW file into Lightroom. This is not your fault, this is actually by design. Because you see, inside your camera there's a Bayer filter, and this splits light into red, green and blue across the pixels of your sensor. And when you put your SD card into your computer, you throw the file into Camera Raw, Lightroom, Capture One, whatever software you're using. That editing software needs to combine all these dots of color into a full color, somewhat finished raw image. And that's what you see on the screen in front of you. And that blending process slightly smooths edges and dulls fine details. So when you open a RAW file, it's going to look a little bit lifeless, and that is normal. JPEGs look sharper when you look at them on the back of your camera screen, or if you just shoot JPEGs and you throw them on your computer, because your camera is secretly doing this sharpening for you. But when you shoot RAW, which by design doesn't do this sharpening step so that you've got control over that when you go through the editing process, you've got to add that sharpening back in manually. Now, the most reliable way to add this post-capture sharpening is with a tool that is weirdly called an unsharp mask tool. Now, I realize the name is a bit backwards here, but the concept is simple. The software finds the edges in your image and then boosts contrast around those edges, making light pixels perhaps a little bit lighter and dark pixels a little bit darker. This creates the perception of a sharper image without you having to use a time machine and go back in time to change your focus, camera settings, or whatever you wanted to change when you were originally shooting, right? Now, in Lightroom, sharpening has 4 main sliders. You've got amount, which controls how strong the sharpening is. You've got radius, which tells Lightroom how far from the edge it should apply all these effects to. You've got detail, which determines whether it targets fine textures or larger shapes. Then you've got masking, which decides where sharpening happens. And usually you don't want the entire image to be sharp. You want to use this masking tool, as I'll show you in a second, to sharpen just the main elements of it. So, for example, if I'm sharpening this landscape image, I'm going to hold Alt whilst dragging the masking slider, and you're going to see that everything that is white on the screen is going to get sharpened, everything black is going to remain untouched. And this is a real game changer because I rarely want to sharpen the clouds or even the mountains in the background of my images. I typically just want to sharpen my foreground. I want that to appear razor sharp because that's how it feels in reality. When you look at a scene, the entire scene isn't razor sharp because your eyes are only focusing on one part of the scene at a time. Next, I'm going to use a small radius because I'm only trying to increase the perceived sharpness of the edges of the elements within my composition. And I'm going to use large detail so the sharpness is increased even on larger shapes and textures within the scene as well. And then finally, I'm going to slowly increase the amount of sharpening until it looks good to my eye as I'm looking at my computer monitor. And once I started applying sharpening properly, my photos, well, they instantly looked better, but there was still something missing, right? The images were technically sharper, yes, they look sharper, fine. Box ticked, but they didn't have that crisp kind of pop that you almost feel when the elements of your scene jump out of the screen at you. And you see this a lot with professional landscape photography work. There's almost like a depth to the image, and this again increases the perceived sharpness of the photo. So I started looking beyond just sharpening. I started looking into the tricks that our eyes play that lead to more perceived sharpness in a scene. And that's why I discovered the final piece of this puzzle, and that is contrast. At first, I thought contrast and sharpness were basically the same thing, but after experimenting in Lightroom, I realized that they are close cousins, but they do slightly different jobs. Sharpening only affects edges. It increases the contrast in small local areas, right where 2 different amounts of lightness, 2 shades of lightness meet. Contrast, on the other hand, affects the whole image, and it stretches the difference between. You think of it literally like stretching the difference between your lights and your darks, and together they control how defined your photo is going to feel. And here's the simplest way to see it. If you take a slightly soft image, one that looks dull but in focus, and you don't touch the sharpening slider at all, and you just focus on contrast first, you're going to see that the photo suddenly starts to wake up a little bit. Blacks deepen, highlights pop, and the whole thing looks a little bit crisper, even though nothing about the focus or the literal sharpness of the image has changed. And that is because, again, sharpness is really perceived separation. And the stronger the difference between the different tones, the sharper the edges of your image is going to look to your eyes. It's a visual trick, but it works every single time. And one mistake that I see beginners make over and over and over again in our Facebook group, which is the Photography Explained Photo Review Club, where you can submit your photos for free, and I and other people in the community, I think we're up to about 750 people at this point, will all give you tons of good feedback on those images. You can join by clicking the link that's in the description below this video, or you can search for the group on Facebook. It's pretty obvious to find, pretty easy to find. A mistake that I see all the time is that beginners over sharpen the heck out of their image without balancing out the contrast first. And when you push sharpening too far, you're going to get things like ugly halos, which are bright outlines around the edges of the contrasty parts of your scene, and they scream that the image has been over-edited. It just looks fake, it looks a bit odd. Instead, what we want to do is small, balanced adjustments across the entire scene. We want to raise the contrast slightly, we want to look at sharpening the edges, we want to do it just enough that it appears sharp to our eyes without going just overblown on all of this. And when I started combining these 2 editing steps, contrast for overall punch, sharpening for a little bit of edge detail, everything started to click. I realized that sharpness isn't always about chasing the perfect focus or a crazy expensive lens. It's about understanding how the human eye reads edges and tones in a scene, and that was my aha moment. So give it a go yourself, and if you want to continue leveling up your photography, why not click the video that's on the screen right now.